Under every one of my numerous videos dealing with the demographic crisis, its general causes and consequences, as well as multiple regional deep dives focusing on specific countries or regions, one type of objection to my arguments, that usually tends to be more culturally than economically focused, is constantly being repeated. And that is the claim that I omit the immense importance of the housing crisis. If housing is preposterously expensive and thus largely unaffordable to the general public and especially young people, it is logical that it will tremendously depress the birth rates. And this is an entirely logical reflection. Suppose you cannot afford to leave your parents' house and live alone. In that case, having kids is pretty much impossible, unless your parents have some kind of large house suitable for multi-generational cohabitation. And even if they do, try to persuade your missus to live so close to her mother-in-law in this day and age, right? If you need to spend a very high proportion of your income on housing, whether on rent or mortgage payments, you have less disposable income to use for everything else, including the expenses connected to having children. More than that, owning a residential property gives people a significant sense of security and stability in their lives, which might once again contribute to the decision of starting a family or enlarging an already existing one. Yet another important factor is the size of the dwellings, which empirically influences family size. So, the issues of housing and birth rates are obviously interconnected, and it would be foolish to pretend otherwise. However, if one does a relatively simple comparison of the housing affordability in various developed countries and their fertility rates, it becomes clear that there is no straight correlation whatsoever between these two variables. So, in this video, I will try to entangle this conundrum. Let's get to it. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer delivered his first keynote speech, where he emphasized the need for systemic overhaul and preparing for upcoming tough financial decisions. Ground News found 85 sources covering this, coming from across the political spectrum and the world, ensuring I get an on-the-ground perspective of every story I read. And comparing coverage with tags that give me more insight on each outlet, I can see how right-leaning Great Britain news is stoking fears on what Starmer's budget will do to the middle class, while left-leaning The Independent is focusing on Starmer's vows to reverse the populism and failure of the previous government. Without easy access to diverse global and political perspectives on what's happening in the UK, I'd have a partial and possibly biased understanding of their economic crisis. That's why I'm partnering with Ground News again for this video. They are an app and website that gathers related news from thousands of sources around the world, so readers can compare how different outlets cover the same story, with context on their political bias, credibility, and even who funds them. I personally love using their blind spot feed, which highlights important news receiving little coverage from the left or right. It helps me to step out of my echo chamber and see stories I might have missed because of my biased news consumption. Most of us, myself included, have our biases. Sometimes we maybe do not even realize it. That's why I love to use Ground News to keep mine in check. So, go to ground.news/Kaiser or scan my QR code to try them out today. My link saves you 40% on the same Vantage plan I use to get unlimited access to all their amazing features. You'd be supporting my work and an independent news platform I really trust at the same time. So, the first thing I would like to get out of the way is the aforementioned lack of correlation between housing affordability and fertility rates. The last time I talked about this issue was in my video on Southern European demographic decline. In this video, I concluded that housing affordability cannot be declared as one of the regionally specific reasons for the ultra-low fertility rates in Southern Europe. The reason for this claim was simple. Southern European countries as a whole do not score particularly badly in various comparisons of housing affordability. Many people were angered by me saying this and protested in the comments, saying that the housing in their country or city is impossibly expensive. And yes, I'm not saying housing is affordable where you live. Housing is probably massively expensive almost everywhere. What I'm saying is that if housing prices were the main driver of ultra-low fertility, there would need to be some correlation between fertility rates and housing affordability. But there is none whatsoever. There are many ways of trying to measure the affordability of housing. We can look at the house price to income ratios, which refer to the number of average yearly wages needed to buy an average priced home in different countries and cities. We can also look at the ratio of housing costs to disposable income in various countries and cities, whether rent or mortgage payments. Whatever metric one uses, the results are always the same. It is a mixed bag without any clearly observable correlation between housing affordability and fertility rates. I studied countless datasets by OECD, European Union, and various housing affordability indexes by Deloitte and similar companies. Italy is, for example, one of the most affordable countries when considering the house price to income ratio, and Rome is one of the most affordable major cities in Europe. On the other hand, Israel is one of the least affordable countries, but the fertility rate in Israel is on a completely different level than in Italy. Portugal's major cities are very unaffordable, but then again, Portugal still had somewhat higher fertility than Italy. When it comes to household expenditures on housing as a percentage share of all expenditures, it is once again a mixed bag of sorts. Countries with relatively higher fertility rates like the UK, Ireland, New Zealand or France pay a higher share of their total expenditures for housing than countries like South Korea, Poland or Spain. OECD data shows that the share of low-income private tenants spending more than 40% of income on rent is significantly higher in the US or the UK than in Germany or Austria. Yet the fertility rate is traditionally higher in the Anglosphere than in German-speaking Europe. Vienna is one of the etalons of affordable housing, where the average rent-to-income ratio was just over 10% in 2020. Yet the fertility rate in Vienna has been persistently lower than 1.5 for decades. When it comes to subjective measurements, such as the share of young people concerned about being able to find or maintain adequate housing, Spain, a low fertility country, is highest. But South Korea, the country with absolutely lowest fertility in the world, is relatively low in this measurement, not that far from France, a relatively high fertility country. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, has a fertility rate of 0.55 children per woman. Now, it is true that the income to house price ratio is very high in Seoul. About 15 yearly median wages are needed to buy a median priced home. But then again, this variable is very similar or even worse in Prague, Bratislava or Paris. The estimates often vary, but Politico claims you need 25 yearly median incomes to purchase a 75-meter flat in Prague and 23 in Paris. And yet, the fertility rate in Prague or Paris is nowhere near as low as in Seoul. And the rent-to-income ratio in Seoul is under 20%, so significantly lower than in other major world cities. Tokyo has more affordable housing than most other world cities like New York, London or Paris, yet a significantly lower fertility rate. In the United States, there is more correlation than in Europe, with the belt of Midwestern states where housing is generally more affordable, like the Dakotas, Nebraska or Iowa, also having the highest fertility rate. But then again, the correlation is also pretty strong with urbanization rates or the percentage of college-educated people. The lowest fertility region in the US, New England, does not belong among the most unaffordable when it comes to housing. And some very affordable states, like Michigan or Pennsylvania, have low fertility in the US context. Singapore is another fascinating example to look at. Singapore has a very elaborate and well thought out housing policy, where up to 95% of flat sales are set aside for first-time applicants, including special priority for young couples. There are also many more tax schemes and subsidies in play. One of the results is that in 2022, typical prices for a 4-bedroom apartment for first-time buyers ranged from $372,000 to $522,000. That is cheaper than in the Czech Republic, and the wages in Singapore are in a completely different galaxy. And yet, Look at the fertility rate in Singapore. It is under 1 child per woman now. The data for the fertility rate of Chinese cities is relatively hard to come by, but I would be willing to bet that it is relatively similar in Beijing or Shanghai to Singapore, even though Singapore has much more affordable housing. I would be also willing to bet that if you would just give out free, spacious, affordable houses to highly educated Han Chinese, they would maybe have 1.4 children per woman if it happens to be a year of the dragon or something. East Asian ethnicities have the lowest fertility rate in the United States, even though they operate under vastly different socio-economic circumstances, housing market included, than in their East Asian homelands. To conclude this chapter, I would say the following. In modernity, defined by living in an industrialized, urbanized, highly educated and secularized society, with female participation in education and the labor force, fertility rates will be low. Broad cultural and anthropological reasons largely dictate a sort of fertility spectrum in which different countries and cultural reasons operate. For example, the fertility spectrum in which countries of the Anglosphere operate is clearly different from the one in which countries in East Asia, German-speaking, or Southern Europe operate. House prices are, however, one of the important factors influencing which part of that fertility spectrum countries are in. In many countries of the Anglosphere or Northwestern Europe, for example the US, UK, France, New Zealand, Sweden, Ireland, Australia or Iceland, the fertility rate reached a replacement level for a couple of years in the good times before the large financial crisis of 2010. However, in countries in Southern Europe, East Asia or German-speaking Europe, the fertility rate did not go over 1.5 for decades. So, house prices are a significant influence and can lower fertility rates, as we will examine in the next chapter. Still, they cannot serve as the sole or even major explanation of the differences between countries and cultural regions. That is because people from absolutely every country or region I made a video about are complaining about the house prices. However, the correlation between house prices and fertility is non-existent. Vienna would need to have significantly higher fertility than London, for example, but their fertility is more or less the same. In the second chapter of this video, I would like to examine if we can find a correlation between changes in the affordability of housing and fertility rates in different countries. That can help us to establish the precise connection between fertility rates and housing affordability. The first thing to establish is that our current perception of home ownership is relatively new, basically happening after World War II throughout most of the West. In the United States, the massive increase in home ownership rates took place during the economic miracle period of the post-World War II decades, where it increased from levels between 40 and 50% to levels between 60 and 70%, where it stays to these days. The story in the UK is somewhat similar. The owner-occupied houses rose from around 25% in 1918 to about a third in 1939, and then to levels between 60 and 70% in the decades after the Second World War. The trajectory was similar in English-speaking countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Ireland. In German-speaking Europe, the trend of increasing home ownership also occurred, although it never got to as high levels as in the Anglosphere, and stayed under 50% in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. A similar story occurred in France, where the home ownership rate also increased from levels around 35% after the Second World War to around 55% in the early 2000s. Spain has also seen its home ownership rise from already pretty high levels of around 50% to a peak level of around 80% in the early 2000s. The exception to this rule seems to be Japan, where the home ownership rate actually declined throughout the second half of the 20th century, probably as a consequence of rising urbanization rates and people moving from self-owned homes in the countryside to rented apartments in the metropolitan areas. So, we can conclude that buying a home was increasingly common throughout the Western world after the Second World War. And in most cases, the houses were cheaper back then, often massively so. The meme about your parents saving for their 5-bedroom house by having a summer job for 3 months while you work in your corporate office job for 12 hours a day to barely afford rent while living off ramen noodles is true to a certain extent. But then again, how many kids did your parents have? Most of my audience was already born in times of low fertility, especially in Europe. This meme is applicable mostly to grandparents of young Westerners. The baby boomers themselves, the generations born in the post-World War II baby boom, did not have that many children. If we look at the correlation between fertility rates and these processes, things again do not seem so conclusive. The initial massive decline in fertility rates to sub-replacement levels happened at a remarkably similar time frame throughout the vast majority of the Western world. They declined throughout the 1960s from the very high baby boom levels and went sub-replacement in the early 1970s. One can definitely make an argument that the economic depression of the 1970s and the shock of the oil prices contributed to the decline. But the revolution of the times was, first and foremost, cultural. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the fertility rates declined throughout most of the West, house prices did not go through much of a drastic change. In Germany, the house price to income ratio was actually significantly declining from the 1980s all the way to 2010s. Possibly also due to the weak demographic cohorts born since the 1970s entering the housing market. Did the German fertility rate react by an increase? Nope, not an inch. As low as it gets. In Japan, the house price to income ratio also started to decline significantly in the 1990s, likely due to Japan's economic crisis and the demographic hollowing out of the land of the rising sun. Yet again, the Japanese fertility rate stayed persistently ultra low. Italy is another interesting example. The Italian house price to income ratio declined in the 1980s, when it was lowest out of all major Western countries. Then, it slowly increased to its peak just before the 2008 financial crisis, after which it again started to decline. Today, Italy is empirically one of the developed countries with the most affordable housing in relation to median income, and Rome is the most affordable capital city in Europe. Yet the Italian fertility rate barely noticed these changes. Now, there are countries where the increase in the house prices is really huge. Something clearly happened in the past couple of decades that really sent the house prices into an overdrive. In the United Kingdom, the average house price as a multitude of yearly earnings started to grow significantly in the 1990s. This growth continued until the big financial crisis, after which it declined a bit, but it nevertheless returned to growth and reached the highest figures in maybe a century now. And the fertility rate in the UK has indeed declined to its lowest level ever, being 1.4 in 2023. Now, housing affordability definitely plays a role in the mix of factors leading to this outcome. However, if we look at it from a more historical perspective, we can see that the current house price to income ratio is roughly similar to the middle of the 19th century. At that time, the UK's fertility rate was around 5 children per woman. A relatively similar story as in the UK happened all over the Anglosphere. Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the United States all copied the same trend of the housing prices massively growing up to the 2010 financial crisis, after which they temporarily declined, just to go through the roof again after the COVID crisis. In all the mentioned countries, the fertility rate has reached an all-time low over the past couple of years. So yes, in these cases, the housing situation most definitely does interfere with the fertility rates. But then again, let's keep things in a more zoom-out perspective. Canadian fertility has been sub-replacement for 50 years now. The current fertility dip is notable and relevant, but it is not like it is some form of complete demographic revolution. Between 1957 and 1977, the Canadian fertility rate declined by 2.2 children per woman. Now that is a demographic revolution. Yet the housing affordability at the time of this decline was still pretty awesome according to today's standards. Between 2000 and 2022, the 2 decades during which house prices underwent a truly gargantuan increase to ridiculous levels, the fertility rate declined by about 0.25 children per woman. You can apply similar logic to most of the other countries. If we look not at home prices but at rent-to-income ratios, we will arrive at similar conclusions. Rents underwent similar increases as home prices, getting off the charts especially since the 1990s. But yet again, the overall fertility rate in the West underwent its most massive and significant declines at a time when both house prices and rents were very affordable compared to today. For example, in the UK, the overall rent-to-income ratio increased most significantly throughout the 1980s, from over 10% of income spent on rent to almost 30%. Yet the British fertility rate was stable in the period, around 1.8 children per woman. In 2023, the fertility rates declined to the lowest level ever, or very close to it, in a number of countries around the Western world: United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Finland and Ireland, as well as in many countries all over the planet like Chile, Thailand, Tunisia, Philippines, Argentina, Brazil, Belarus or Iran. One cannot reasonably claim that the evolution of affordable housing in all those places is undergoing similarly detrimental processes simultaneously. A much more likely explanation is the rapid deterioration of mental health initiated by the spread of smartphones and social media, and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2023, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Israel were Europe's three most unaffordable countries, according to Deloitte, while Italy, Norway and Denmark were the three most affordable. The fertility rate in these countries, basically the same in Slovakia, Czechia, Norway and Denmark. Remarkably high in Israel and remarkably low in Italy. It is just a mixed bag. In the Czech Republic, housing affordability has been declining massively for over a decade in a row, and housing is truly ridiculously expensive. Yet in 2021, when Czechs needed 12.3 median annual incomes to afford a new home, a figure higher than in San Francisco, the fertility rate stood at 1.83 children per woman. Now, I am aware that this analysis is not bulletproof, and there are some missing elements. For example, if the housing was getting more expensive, but the overall inflation was low and real incomes were rising, your expenses for housing could increase from 10 to 30% of your overall expenses, but the remaining 70% would still allow you the same or higher living standards. When the rising housing costs are accompanied by the overall inflation at the same time, such as during the post-COVID period, it makes things much harder on folks. But overall, the argument regarding housing affordability as the main reason for low fertility ultimately has the same issues as the overall materialist explanations for low fertility by economic conditions. They certainly matter. But unless we are talking about something truly apocalyptic, such as famine or something, there are merely a factor influencing fertility within the boundaries determined by culture. Without a significant cultural revolution, no level of material well-being would, for example, make the current populations of East Asia have large families. The empirical evidence in this regard is abundant. I mean, just think about the fact that the biggest decline in fertility rates came after the two biggest increases in living standards in modern history. First after the Industrial Revolution, and then in the economic miracle period after the Second World War. Economic shocks, fluctuation in housing affordability, and other similar factors undoubtedly influence the fertility rate, but usually on a relatively short-term basis. While I do agree that the overall prosperity of the population, and especially the young people, throughout the Western world is declining compared to the sort of golden age post-war decades, and even their parents 20 or 30 years ago, the overall material prosperity of our civilization is still absolutely incredible in comparison with basically any period of history before us. I like to think about it in terms of communicating vessels. Suppose you have an overall culture that is strongly spiritually pro-natalist and possesses strong cultural norms giving meaning to people's lives. In that case, the amount of economic hardship that the reproductive behavior of society can withstand without major deterioration is very high. On the contrary, if the overall cultural atmosphere within society is strongly antinatalist and dysfunctional, as our society undoubtedly is, the ability of material conditions to strongly negatively influence fertility rates significantly increases. And the thing about the economy and material conditions is that they are by definition volatile. No good time lasts forever. It is the strong culture that gets societies through periods of material hardship intact. If the benchmark of material well-being society needs to produce sustainable birth rates is the 1950s in the West, maybe the most prosperous period of the history of humankind for the average person, then the culture is obviously broken. And it is, of course, essential to note that culture and economics are not some strictly divided spheres that do not mutually interact. Culture influences the economy massively and vice versa. It is entirely legitimate to claim that the costs of raising a child in the past were much lower than today. But a lot of these costs are indeed culturally determined. Culture shapes how we think about consumption, what aspects of life we sanctify and prioritize, what level of material conditions is deemed satisfactory for a child, how we think about housing, how we think about the role of extended family in our lives, living with or very close to your parents, how low or high status being a parent is, and plethora of other things. When one debates demographics with people from Western countries, one can very often hear sentences like, "It is completely unaffordable to have kids now. Only the migrants from Africa or Asia have large families." Well, the thing is, if they are able to do it in a socio-economic environment similar to Westerners, then it is cultural. So, I think we can conclude that even though housing affordability indeed does play an important role in determining on which end of the modernity-fertility spectrum societies momentarily are, the spectrum itself is culturally determined first and foremost. Overall, the role of housing affordability, as well as the material conditions themselves, is overrated in the demographic debate.